Awesome. I think we're live. Hey everyone. I am Aliki Moncrief. I'm the Executive Director of Florida Conservation Voters, and we could not be more excited to be joining journalist and author Mario Alejandro Ariza today to talk about climate change and the future of Florida. So, hey there, Mario.
Hey, Lisa. How's it going?
It's going as well as it possibly can. We're one day closer to the weekend.
Yeah.
What are we? 68 days from the election, 5 months into a pandemic. It's going as well as it possibly can. So
well, that's good.
Yeah. Well, so we are really excited to have you here today and thought we would kick off with really just you telling us a little bit about yourself and your recent release, Disposable City, which is definitely the book that everybody wants to hear about.
Cool. Well, thank you. And thank you for having me on.
Absolutely.
And I'd like to apologize a little bit. My audio may be a little bit fuzzy, so sorry about that. I have to figure out how to fix that. Did not really anticipate doing all of these virtual events when this book was being written. So yeah, Mario Ariza, and I am the federal courts reporter at the South Florida Sun Sentinel. Though now that there aren't any federal jury trials because of the pandemic, I mainly cover the pandemic. And also I'm developing a sub-beat, which is, keeping South Florida police forces accountable. So I recently published a book called Disposable City, Miami's Future on the Shores of Climate Change. It is very much designed to take people from 0 to 100 on the effects that human-caused climate change is going to have here in South Florida and in other cities around the country and the world, right? It's really designed sort of as a fun guide for you to understand what this phenomenon can really do to a city, what it can really do to your pocketbook, and what it can do to, your plans. The reason I wrote this book is because I'm a Miami native, or as native as can be here in the city. I'm originally from the Dominican Republic, and so I came here when I was 6 years old, grew up in Miami, left when I was 18 thinking, I'm done with this place. I never want to deal with it again. There's no culture here. It's a backwards party town. I don't like to go clubbing. Never coming back. When I was 28. Still don't like to go clubbing. You can't really talk at this point. And fell back in love with Miami. Fell back in love with the city. It's had a vibrant culture. It was where my family was. It was really the only place where culturally, as somebody who is, too American for the Dominicans, but too Dominican for the Americans sometimes, it's the only place where I felt like I fit in. And that love affair, the rekindling of that love for my hometown, was also the period where I started diligently researching and what climate change was going to do. And the product of that is... and I apologize because my image is mirrored sometimes, but it's the city. I don't know how to fix that.
I don't know, but your sound was better when you were leaning to the right too. I don't know what that is.
Okay, so that may be because the microphone is here in my lap.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move that over here and unplug a monitor while I do that. Great. Oh, there you go. Flash. So anyways, that's kind of my story. And that's sort of the gist of why I wrote this book. It's my first book. Writing books is hard, and I hope you like it.
I can imagine it's hard. Well, we'll have to talk offline someday. Your story has we have a lot in common.
Really?
Maybe surprisingly. I grew up in Miami. I had the same feeling. I think I got there when I was 4.5, 5, somewhere in there. And so, like you said, as native, it's close.
As close as native as you can get, yeah.
Exactly. But had a very similar feeling, and I've often talked about it as a kind of a love-hate relationship with Miami. But we'll talk about that offline because we want to talk about your book, not about me. So what was what was something or what surprised you most as you were doing your research? Or was there anything that really surprised you about climate change in Miami?
Sure, yeah. So the most surprising thing for me while I was studying climate change in Miami, and we've heard a lot about environmental racism and we've heard a lot about environmental justice. But what really surprised me was how baked into the structure, the physical structure of the city, the social structure of the city, how racism was baked into it, and how that was already contributing to incredibly difficult outcomes with just a little bit of climate change on the people who could least afford to adapt, right? And so, to give you an example, right? Most of Miami is about like at 6 feet above sea level. There's a lot of it that's a lot less than 6 feet above sea level, and there's a strip of it along the coast of Miami-Dade County that it's called the Atlantic Coastal Ridge. Because of the way that segregation and racist redline housing policies worked in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, most of the minorities in South Florida were not allowed to purchase land on the waterfront, right? They're not allowed. I mean, it's like banks would not lend you, right?
Right.
Okay, Aliki, where are you from? What's your race? Nope, we don't want it, right? But in the manuals for lending, right, that they gave to mortgage appraisers, they would rate adverse things that could, like ding whether or not you should lend to a property. And they actually would rate properties that were super low-lying and prone to flooding and very likely to be destroyed in a hurricane higher, right? They would give them higher scores than, that's my dog right behind me, and properties that were next to the homes of minorities, right? So it was really better to flood than to be next to a minority in South Florida. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, no worries. You remember that?
Sorry, she's a little rude.
No worries. You just reminded me of, I don't remember, it was a couple years ago, there was like a BBC reporter whose toddler came in, and he didn't, I don't know if he didn't have he was maybe in shorts or something from the waist down, and he had to get, Anyway, yours was much more mild.
Oh, hey. Good. I feel like my dog is like my toddler sometimes. So and then that contributed, that historical redlining contributed to this really weird thing that's going on now that we call climate gentrification, where the minorities that were redlined onto the high ground are now losing the high ground because the people on the low ground want the high ground, right? And you're like, what? But that happened like 70 years ago, 80 years ago. What's going on?
Yeah.
But climate change, one of the most surprising things was how climate change really will take inequality and crank it up.
Yeah.
Make it more unequal and more devastating and more difficult to live with.
Yeah, they talk about it having an amplifying effect in a lot of ways. And so in terms of inequities, it's the example that you're giving is a really good one of that amplification of existing inequities, making them worse. Kind of old style, that's not even right. Like pre-climate, before climate was an issue, gentrification pushed, Black, Latino communities aside and, obviously cordon them off. The irony I find with climate gentrification is it's also pushing them potentially into the danger zones.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you look where a lot of and one of the problems with this is that we don't have very good data because, the powers that be don't really have an interest in measuring where these communities are going, right? And so nobody has told us, okay, in the past 2 decades, X amount of people from Little Haiti in Miami, which is on the high ground, have moved to, Homestead. But we know that Homestead, which is on the low ground, is the most rapidly growing area in the county, and it's where a lot of affordable housing is getting built. And you're like, oh, good, yay, affordable housing. affordable housing in Miami-Dade County at 2 feet above sea level is only going to last for one mortgage cycle, right? At the current projections, if you're lucky. Right. And so what are you doing to those families? You're condemning them to, not being able to accrue generational wealth. You're condemning them to losing that nest egg. And so, well, not only that, but like the commute is going to be awful. There's more carbon that's going to be spewed because people have to go back and forth, the traffic. And when you move people from their communities, their existing social relationships, which are actually their best defense against major shocks like a hurricane or a heat wave, right? Because what are you going to do? You're going to check on your neighbors. Right. Those relationships get broken. And so, an elderly person who lives in a neighborhood that may not be as high income, but who has grown up there and knows everybody on the block is actually statistically much more likely to survive a storm than a richer person in a neighborhood where they don't know anybody.
Right.
So,
yeah. And there's it's sort of incalculable how valuable it is to have that community in terms of making individual people, families more resilient to these disasters. So that's a great example. I mean, so, climate change, definitely an amplifier. One of the things that I think you write about is how so many things are connected to climate change. Like we just talked about gentrification as an example. Right now, I know you're aware, others who are watching may not be. I can't imagine anyone in Florida is not aware right now of the massive fish kills, the algae blooms that are just destroying Biscayne Bay right now. That's been linked to septic systems, elevated temperatures. Obviously, elevated temperatures are linked to climate. So can you share a little bit more about, just that dynamic? Yeah,
absolutely.
Perfect.
So one of the reasons why I wrote the book the way that I did, right? And it's my personal journey through figuring out what climate change is going to do to Miami is because as you go and try, or as I go and try and figure this out, I sort of try and teach you a little bit of systems thinking, right? Systems thinking is a really great frame or lens with which to look at how climate systems work and also how climate systems interact with human and urban systems, right? And you're like, systems, this sounds complex. And yeah, it's complicated, but at the end of the day, it's a little bit like, I don't know, like nothing exists in isolation, right? And it's also that nothing exists in isolation, but also nothing temporally exists in isolation. So decisions that were made ages and ages ago are having repercussions today. And those decisions was the decision to allow folks in the interest of making developers happy here in the 40s, 50s, and 60s to use these things called septic tanks. So for those of us not familiar with what a septic tank is, I'll just explain it very quickly. It is actually a concrete box behind your house where your poop goes. And attached to that concrete box are a bunch of pipes, right? And the poopy water goes into the box, the poop down at the bottom of the box, the water goes out the pipes, slowly into the ground. Bacteria filter the water, and in ideal circumstances, that water gets cleaned by that bacteria. But there's a couple of things that can break that down, right? One, if you don't have a foot, at least 12 inches of clearance between the pipes and the groundwater table, right? Because with clearance, the bacteria don't have enough place to hang out and they're not going to clean the water. Or if you don't have enough open space for the pipes, right? If your lot is too small. So why does this matter? Well, because as Miami grew very, very quickly in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, people didn't feel like spending the extra $20,000 or $30,000 to connect their houses to sewer.
Right.
They decided that they were going to put these septic tanks in. They're cheaper. They're like $4,000, $5,000. And that was going to be the end of it. Great. Well, now the county has, of its like 500 or 600,000 property parcels, 110 or 120,000 are on septic.
Yeah.
Some of them are businesses that put all kinds of things that they shouldn't put into those septic tanks. But houses in South Miami, Homestead, and a lot of them are also houses in Portal, Miami Shores, along, the Little River Basin, up in that section of the city, which saw a lot of development in those ages. With the increase in sea levels and the increase in rains during the rainy season, right? Because climate change doesn't just affect the heat and the storms and the sea level. It also makes the rain harder, though less frequently, right? You have an increase in the water table. And so now about half of those septic tanks, 55,000 of them, don't work about half the time during the rainy season.
Wow.
Right? They're just, all that poop is going straight into the canal.
Right.
And all of that is connected because the were made before you and I got here to the city. All of that goes out into the bay. Now, when you add all of those nutrients into the nutrients that are already in the water flowing down from Lake Okeechobee, you get water that is very, very polluted.
Uh-oh. And I'm frozen.
Oh, you're frozen?
Oh, was it just me?
Am I frozen? No.
I can't tell.
You're not frozen.
I'm not frozen now.
But yeah, so the Biscayne Bay fish kill that we saw last week or 2 weeks ago, and then the outbreak that we have today. One of the major contributors is all of these septic tanks, but it's not the only contributor, right? Because you have all the pollution coming down from Lake O, you have the increased temperatures because of climate change. And you also have the way in which fresh water is delivered to Biscayne Bay, right? Imagine when people first got to Biscayne Bay, the water flow, there were no locks at the end of the canals. There were no canals. It was just the Everglades and the Miami River delivering fresh water constantly into the bay. So the bay had a low salinity level. There was lots of turtle grass. And there were actually sections of the bay where you would have natural springs in the middle of the saltwater, gushing fresh water out, right?
Yeah. Venetian pool, right, is one of those vestiges of that old
those freshwater springs,
right?
And that's because the Biscayne aquifer is an open aquifer. But the issue is now we have these gravity gates that control the flow in and out of the canal system that drain Miami, which, by the way, are all going to have to get replaced with pumps if we want to keep our drainage. But that's a different conversation. And so instead of regular water flow, you have pulses. And these pulses can be really devastating, and they can kill a lot of fish. So you've got the pulses, you've got the poopy water, you've got the polluted water from Lake O, you've got the high temperatures. And what's that led to is a decrease in 90% of the seagrass in Biscayne Bay just dying over the past decade, right? So the entire ecology of the bay has shifted, and it's gone seagrass ecosystem in many sections to just kind of like a sandy bottom. And happens when a storm kicks up a sandy bottom. There's, stuff in the water column, and the bacteria love to feed on that stuff, and the algae feed on the bacteria, and so on and so forth. And they use up all the oxygen in the water, and there go all our turtles, or all our fish. And our bay is going from this beautiful blue-green gem to just kind of like a scummy green pool that hasn't been cleaned in a while.
Yeah. Well, sometimes when I think about, and it's not unique to Miami, but Miami's definitely an example of it. It's such an altered, engineered system. You talked about systems earlier, right? And so you're talking about how we've sort of altered and engineered it in a way that we're not like the things that nature would do, the services that nature would provide, if some people want to talk about it that way. We've sort of we've thrown a wrench in those systems. And I think sometimes people feel like, well, that happened before I got here. It's a little daunting to think about how to solve that. So, I mean, a question that I have for you, and plus, there's septic, there's the World War II era sewer systems, like a lot of those are failing. We didn't even talk about those.
Right.
So, I mean, when we're facing things like that, I mean, because I know you talk a lot about advocacy, what are people to do? Like, what are some of the best things that you think they can be doing to be solving these problems that were started, before they may have even arrived?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the wonderful things about the American system, and there's a lot to be criticized about the American democratic system at the moment, right? Because some would argue that we're not necessarily a democracy right now, but a good totalitarian system. But that at least at the local level, people have an incredible power, an incredible voice, right? Because your politicians are your neighbors. So, I mean, do you know who your local commissioner is? Do you know who your mayor is? Have you called them recently? Have you told them that you're concerned about the fish kill in the bay? Are you engaged with them in a way? Are you checking out the commission meetings? Are you reading the agenda packets, right? Are you engaged with your local government that is making these local decisions about your urban geography in a way that, is either negatively or could positively affect it? And the problems that we have are not outside of the realm of being solved, right?
Right.
It would cost some money. In fact, it would cost about $3.2 billion to put all the septic onto sewer. But that's a lot of jobs at the same time. Right?
Exactly.
And the county has the bonding capacity. They're municipalities. They can issue the debt. It would be a lot of money to fix all of our sewer systems. We have the bonding capacity to do so. And it also, is not outside of the realm of possibility for us to start integrating blue-green infrastructure solutions, right? Like ways to use nature to help us live with the water that's going to show up more specifically. And it's incumbent upon folks who live in their districts to say, hey, look, I see here, Commissioner so-and-so, you have a plan for cutting the grass here and doing this, and this with the swales. Let's look at something different. Let's use the swales as a way to collect rainwater and to filter the rainwater by planting these plants. And that way we don't have to pay anybody to chop the plants down, every month. Can store rainwater and fix it. And you start advocating for natural systems at your local level, and the resilience of your city and its livability will increase.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the word resilience, actually, because that's the word du jour, the word of the day here in Tallahassee at the state lawmaker level. And I know you spent some time in Disposable City talking about how that language around resilience can be kind of problematic. This idea that it can shift responsibility, either down from the state to the municipal, or I would even argue from the governmental to the individual, or the governmental collective to the personal. So do you feel like what Miami is doing, do you feel like the leadership and the conversations that are happening in Miami adequately reflect how we have to balance kind of resilience adaptation strategies with cutting carbon, cutting emissions?
No, they don't. I'll be about that. I know that there are leaders here in Miami who are very concerned about the survival of their city and who have begun the long process of adapting this place. I do not see many of those same leaders moving at the same time to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the city. And that's a little bit like undergoing chemo for lung cancer while still smoking 2 packs a day, right?
It's a great analogy.
And so there's that, right? Like, we're not practicing what we preach. And we can put in the pumps and raise all roads and harden all the structures we want, but unless we radically shift how we generate our electricity and get from point A to point B in this town, it's not going to matter, right?
Yeah. Well, and in some cases it can backfire too, right? Like some of the adaptation needs, whether it's raising roads or installing pumps, like those could also further harm natural systems.
Yeah, right. Like, because we don't filter the water before we pump it back out, so it further harms the bay, and it like puts a bunch of trash into it. Yeah, no, it's not an ideal fix, the pumps, but we're going to put a lot of them in the next 10 years. I assure you that. What is really missing is for the Florida delegations in Congress at the national level and for the South Florida delegations at the House and Senate levels to speak with unanimity about this issue, right? And that is something that you have direct control over as a citizen. Right? You can call your congressperson, you can call your Florida State House representative, you can call your Florida Senate representative, and you can senator too, and tell them, hey, dude, we need to speak with one voice regardless of party on this issue, right? Otherwise, the federal government is not going to open the checkbook, and we're not going to have the money to literally deliver the city services that the city needs to survive here in 20 to 30 years. That's where we're at right now. So that level of alarm and concern, I'm not seeing. The unanimity from the political elites here, I'm not seeing. And am I seeing a move to swiftly decarbonize? No.
Yeah.
In halting and in some cases swift and decisive action towards adaptation. Adaptation is a band-aid, and you could spend hundreds of billions to adapt the city. Still wouldn't be enough if you don't cut the carbon.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Well, I want to make sure, because I know you have another engagement, and I want to make sure that folks who are watching know that they can certainly pitch questions here. So Carson, who's helping us kind of behind the scenes, I know will pop up questions as they come in. But when it comes to, I mean, I think you're totally right. People have the ability to influence their national, their federal representatives, their state representatives, their local representatives. Totally hear what you're saying in terms of the unanimity that's needed. Like, what do you see? Like, what do you feel like is going to help rectify this disconnect? Because I think a lot of Floridians, they get the need to do both adaptation and also start cutting carbon in a big way, but there's a disconnect between kind of what everyday people are thinking and what lawmakers are doing.
Yeah, I would say that disconnect is so advocacy and all right, so broadly in poli-sci terms, right? The reason why this exists is because civil society is weak, right? And what do I mean by civil society? I mean like who you're hanging out with in the evening. Right? In the 40s and 50s and 60s, when these civil municipal government corporations were established during the expansion area down here, you knew everybody in your neighborhood. You knew them, and you knew everybody in your like greater social milieu, right? Like you would hang out with people in bowling leagues, right? Or you would like go out and picnic in the park. There's a great book by Adam Putnam. I think it's from like the early 90s. It's called, or late 90s, called Bowling Alone. And it's about the decline of civil society. And now we have, and it was actually literally, he was a sociologist who traced the decline in bowling leagues. And he got like cities and places where the bowling leagues died out, all of a sudden, their political solutions or their political processes would break. And it's because you didn't know the people making these decisions, right? Like before, you used to play Little League soccer with the parents of, like the mayor's kids, right? And so that was there. That's not there anymore. Now everybody's online in these managed social media bubbles, which isn't helping us at all. So how do we get away from that? Individually, right? What do you do or what can you do? You need to get engaged in civil society, right? You need to go join a club and make some friends. That's the weirdest solution that you could imagine. Wait, I'm going to solve climate change by making friends? Yes, you're going to solve climate change by making friends and hanging out and doing arts and crafts and bowling and playing soccer, right? But you're also going to talk to those people about climate change and you're going to get them to vote and you're going to get them to participate in their local and municipal elections, which you should be doing as well, right? And you're going to get them to go to, I don't know, commission meetings and opine on particular subjects open for discussion and debate, right? And that's how civil society should work. That's not how it's working right now. And so when are you going to see a major shift? Well, for instance, when the flood insurance for the city of Miami or for residents here, when that spikes because the federal government can no longer afford to subsidize it. And that's when people are going to start paying attention to the particular issue, I think. There's going to be inflection points when climate change really hits people's pocketbooks. The Bay, right? We saw over the past 2 weeks the major fish kill. I can't tell you the number of conversations that I've had with people where they're like, man, I never realized this was because of the septic tanks. And I'm like, yeah, this has been going on for 40 to 50 years, and the knowledge was there. Folks have been talking about it. But now that you're concerned about the Bay, how do we fix it? We make some friends. And we take those friends to the commission meetings and we write letters to the commissioners together. Because that's the system that we have. And it's a good system. I've seen other systems from the Dominican Republic, right? You don't want that system. You want this one. Trust me.
Right. Well, so we have a couple questions coming in here, two that are kind of policy oriented. Let's start with thoughts on carbon fees, carbon dividends as a strategy.
Sure. So I was having a big conversation with Greg Hamra, who may be known to some of the people listening here about carbon fees and dividends. He's a big proponent. And for those who don't necessarily understand what a carbon fee and dividend is, right now, when you burn a fossil fuel and you put that carbon out into the atmosphere, the price that carbon exacts onto the rest of society and the rest of the planet is not priced into what you paid for the fuel, right? So the carbon is an externality to the transaction cost of getting the energy, okay? And a carbon fee would be like a tax. People don't like calling it a tax. It is essentially a tax on your fuel, on your electricity, on your carbon generated, or carbon emitting fuels that would make them less competitive with renewables as a way to transition. Now, that sounds really bad, and it could be, because if you don't then take that money and pay it out to the people who can't really afford to pay that tax, you have a very unequal situation. So that's where the dividend comes in, right? And what you're essentially doing is you're robbing Peter to pay Paul to make sure people put less carbon into the atmosphere, which is a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Although hopefully Peter gets the long-term and collective benefit of doing this. And so rather than robbing Peter, Peter is like, sign me up.
Yes, perhaps robbing Peter. However, there's a major issue, and I'm still having this debate with Greg about it. It's like, and this is the collective action problem of climate change, right? Because if we here in the United States of America say, all right, tax on carbon, and we're going to also tax the carbon that products from other countries include, right? So say if somebody sends you aluminum from China or from Chile or something like that, or copper from Chile, you price in their carbon emissions via a tariff, okay? And a tariff is like, it's a tax on an import. The problem becomes, like, if that country isn't cool with that tariff, they're going to slap a tariff on one of your products. And all of a sudden, prices for consumers are going to rise in a way that you can't necessarily account for. And you're going to have yourself a trade war, which we're very familiar with after 4 years with the current president. So the collective action problem of a carbon fee and dividend is what I haven't seen a solution for, right? And I'm not saying that this isn't a good policy. I'm saying that I don't yet quite understand, or I haven't seen a good proposal for how to fix that collective action problem. Because with the way that world trade and globalization is set up right now, you could pass a carbon fee and dividend, and if you tried to apply it to your trade partners, the World Trade Organization, I think, would let your trade partners slap tariffs on your products as well. Mm-hmm. And it's very messy very quickly. And so you have to solve that problem. But that's not an insurmountable problem. Like, that's what diplomacy is for, right?
Right. Exactly. That's why countries get together and try to figure out the global aspects of these problems. Absolutely. So what about, we have another question here, managed retreat. Are there conversations happening in Miami around that?
Not at the municipal level, not enough of it. There was a brief idea as the years progress, but there at the moment isn't a lot of thought being put in at the municipal level, at the county level, towards buyouts and managed retreat from very, very vulnerable areas. Managed retreat, I think, is something that has to be on the table, though, right? It has to be something that we recognize that, like, the shoreline is not static, right? It moves, it shifts. Humans have been moving with that shoreline, with it, you know, towards the sea and away from the sea for thousands and thousands of years, as long as we've been humans, right? 4,000, like, if you look at the barrier islands here, where Miami Beach and all of those cities are, those are only 4,000 to 5,000 years old, right? And the belief that they're going to be here in 100 or 120 years because of all the CO2 that we're putting in the atmosphere, that's not going to happen, right? So you're going to have to figure out a way to get rid of that land and return it to nature. How to do so is a question that policymakers should be tackling head on. It's one that activists need to be tackling head on, I think, as well. I think this is a section where an issue where mutual aid could be incredibly beneficial and fortuitous, right? Like, you can imagine in a society that had functioning civil society, right? Like, okay, everybody in your bowling group, and I'm picking on bowling group.
I don't know. I think you're promoting them. You're kind of promoting them.
Bowling. Well, actually, not right now because of COVID, but eventually. Yeah. Like, everybody in your bowling group would pitch in for a managed retreat fund, right? And some trustworthy person would hold it as the treasurer. And then when push came to shove and a couple of people's houses had to be bought out, the money would be there to buy the houses out, tear them down, and turn them into nature parks, right? And those people then would maybe have some kind of a cushion or get some kind of a subsidy to move to a more secure location. Mm-hmm. That's what essentially managed retreat might look like at the civil level. It's going to look like at the municipal level, like a lot of eminent domain. Eminent domain is the part where, or the function where the government can buy private property at its taxable rate and use it for, you know, a public good.
Fair market value, right?
Yes. Well, is it? I've always been a little bit unsure if it's the fair market value, because, like, it's the appraised value, not the fair market value.
Huh. I don't know. We can have that as the subject of another conversation. In a previous life, I did do environmental law, and so fair market value jumps into my mind. But I
might be wrong about that. I don't
know. No. Well, so, you know, it's interesting because the ideas that you're putting out there, in some ways, like Florida, we're kind of positioned to be a world leader in coming up with these innovative solutions, because, you know, worldwide, you know, 10%, I think, of the world's population lives within, 30 miles of the coast or something like that. I mean, in Florida, obviously, we that's where all of our population lives. And so, you know, that combined with the fact, and you alluded to it, coastal systems are super dynamic. These barrier islands they haven't been here for that long, relatively speaking. We kind of have an opportunity to be a leader on some of these things.
Yeah, and we're going to have to be if we want to survive. And we're also going to have to figure out how to sell that knowledge, right? Because if you think about what climate is going to do to the major economic drivers of this city, right? To tourism and to real estate, it's going to crater those two things. It's going to look a lot like COVID. And if, you know, your beaches are flooded out and nobody wants to buy homes that, you know, are, well, you can't flush the toilet in, let's just put it that way. And so what are you going to do for money, right? We're becoming a logistics hub, but also all of that knowledge of adapting this place to the ocean that we're going to have to learn very quickly in the next 10 to 20 to 30 years, right? Hard planning the infrastructure, adapting and changing the way people move, all that engineering technology, we can sell it. Other nations that are going to have to adapt. And that can itself become a source of income because we're already this very international city. So I think that that's a particular model that we really need to be examining, and that, you know, economic planners and policy planners here should be looking at.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I know we don't have a ton of time left. I want to, I'm kind of curious about the timeline. You know, I think, you know, as you mentioned, you're a longtime resident, native son, to the extent that anyone can be a native son of Miami. So when you think about kind of your Miami as a kid now compared to Miami 100 years from now, I mean, can you give us some highlights about, you know, if we don't drastically start tackling these solutions, like if we don't muster the political will, if we don't get that unified voice, you know, what are we facing? I don't want to like end necessarily on doom and gloom, but I think it's helpful to have a picture in our minds of what we're trying to prevent.
Yeah, no, I think that. So first of all, I think one of the most important things that we can recognize is that there is a narrow, thin path to Miami's survival. Okay, this city is not doomed, yet, and that's one of the major notes that I hit in my book. Right, if we decarbonize fast enough and adapt intelligently enough, this place can be made to be survivable for what is coming. If we don't do that, though, right, this is going to be a mess. It's just really going to be quite bad. There's a couple of inflection points that have to be looked at very clearly. One is 2060, right? 2 feet by 2060 is what the infrastructure planners are looking at. That's probably when I'm going to be retiring. If there's 2 feet of water here by 2060 and the city has not been accurately and intelligently adapted to that water, right? And we're not even talking about mitigation at that point. System, trash, sewer, electricity delivery, transportation, education, hospitals, emergency services. If that stuff can't function with another 2 feet of water here, this is going to be a dying town. It's going to start looking like Detroit. People are going to be abandoning parts of the city to the ocean. There's 60,000 people that at 2 feet get physically displaced. And then there's this tipping point that was pointed out to me by Matthew Howard, a demographer at FSU, between 3 to 4 feet of sea level rise, which is sometime, you know, depending on the curve you're looking at, 2/3 of the way through this particular century. Anywhere between 100,000 to 200,000 people might get displaced, right? And that's a huge displacement. That's a huge number. That's Little Havana gone, Hialeah gone, anything along the Miami River gone, right? And that's the city's Hispanic working classes and whatever property they were holding. So that's going to be where managed retreat becomes a huge part of it. What do you do with those neighborhoods? What do you do with those people? How do can they go to other cities? What does that look like? So yeah, that's a big tipping point that not a lot of people talk about. But that's you know, a coup de grace for a city. You lose 1/10 of the population, and I don't know, man, it's rough.
Yeah, it's devastating. I mean, there's really no other way to put it. Well, fortunately, you have so much more knowledge to share, and you have put it all in one book,
Yes.
Disposable City. And so I want to make sure folks, just remember that this book is out. We're actually going to be doing it exactly. Thank you. We're going to be talking about it at the FCV Book Club in September. Partly inspired by COVID times, we started a book club. And so we meet every month. Yeah. September 24th is our next book club. It's at 5:30. I think Carson can drop the link in the chat for folks to get more information. And I believe if time permits, I know you're super busy now and you've got a lot of engagements, but
yeah,
I think you might even. Oh, great. Well, I was going to say, though, in September 24th, I think you might be making a quick appearance during that book club.
That night, exactly. I'm totally down. Yes.
That'd be great.
If I don't have anything that night.
Excellent. Well, we do have a few more minutes. So, I mean, is there anything, tell me, what have we not covered that you feel like this, I mean, have we addressed, the core, what you wanted to accomplish in writing this book, your core message?
Yeah, I feel like we've covered a lot of it, and we've covered the how to get engaged and the environmental racism and obviously the septic tanks. I would just really caution folks, this is going to really affect your pocketbook in a way that few other things have, right? Mm-hmm. We haven't necessarily looked at. One, what happens if a hurricane hits, right? If a big one like Laura hits here. And two, what the housing market is going to look like. So if a big hurricane like Laura hits, it could, really change the face of the city and really kick off the process of people leaving Miami. Because it's not like when Hurricane Andrew hit that there was different parts of Miami that people could go to. And we're incredibly vulnerable to storm surge. The Army Corps of Engineers wants to put those walls in. But
what are the walls that you're referring to?
Oh, yes.
Can you elaborate on that? Yeah, because that's kind of it's a big thing.
Okay, so the Achilles heel of the city that you live in is storm surge, right? Big hurricane comes in, pushes a wall of water a bunch of miles inland, floods a bunch of houses, destroys the regional drainage system or renders it inoperable for a couple of months. All of a sudden, you're going back to the Everglades, right? And these houses aren't going to drain for a while. And so the Army Corps of Engineers, in its infinite wisdom and engineering skill, has proposed a plan to essentially build Hadrian's Wall, right? The equivalent. They're talking about 13-foot tall, 10-foot wide walls up and down certain sections of the city that would physically stop a big storm surge from going inland and ravaging and rampaging, like an invading army. So that's the idea. It's kind of crazy because if you can imagine, they want to put one in the middle of the bay, not in the middle, but 50 feet out into the bay in front of Brickell. So a lot of people with a water view are not going to like that. And there's a lot of things with this plan that are worthy of criticism, right? It favors wealthy neighborhoods because of the way that they're doing the cost benefit analyses. It doesn't have a lot of blue-green infrastructure adaptation, right? Mm-hmm. It's kind of done in a typical government fashion. Not a lot of people were aware that this was happening. Not a lot of public comment was given, and they were going to spend $4.6 billion on these walls until people. And so that's the deal with that. But Miami is really, really vulnerable to storm surge. And there's a reason why that was the major adaptation that they wanted to do, right? Because you can adapt to sea level rise if it shows up slowly. But a big storm like that knocks out the port, knocks out the airport, knocks out the financial district. That's it for a little while. So that's one thing. And the second one is, your pocketbook. If you own a home, figure out its vulnerability, figure out if you want to still own that home. Be smart about your money. Be smart about how climate change is going to affect the particular way that you're trying to live your life. because that knowledge is literally going to be dollars in your pocket. So this is very much a book that you can use to help yourself figure that out, if that makes sense.
That just kind of speaks to the breadth of what you cover in the book. I mean, everything from, knowledge to help you be more resilient, knowledge to help you to engage in our civil society, as you said, So we're so excited and so thrilled that you were able to join us tonight. Looking forward to our conversation during our book club more on Disposable City. And so with that, I just want to thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It was fun. We should do it more. Next, you got to write more books and we'll do this more.
Yes. Yeah, I do. I've got to write a couple more books. Have to come up with the book pitches first and then sell them. But that's don't worry.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I mean, now is probably a good time for book writing, just in terms of the world we're living in.
Can't really go outside, so.
Exactly. Might as well write a book.
Might as well.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Mario.
I appreciate it. Have a great, stay safe, folks.
Thanks. You too.
Sure.